Yeah, I remember there was this app many years ago. It was not an app, of course, it was a piece of enterprise software that basically indexed and read every email that was sent by people to build a knowledge management system. And I remember that the crowd back then going, oh my God, this is, the sky's falling in. People are just going to reject it. No, they sold for some phenomenally, huge number in the hundreds of millions of dollars a few years later. So, okay, Geoffrey, please come up. I'm really curious. Independent research lab called Ink and Switch. I'm not familiar with you folks, nor am I familiar with Malleable Software, though I can imagine a little bit of what that's going to be about. So, continuing our AI theme this morning, Geoffrey Litt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. Can you hear me okay? Am I mic'd? Great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Geoffrey Litt. As Tony said, I work at a lab called Ink and Switch, and my research focuses on a thing we call malleable software. And what that means is we're trying to design software environments where people can customize tools in the moment to meet their unique needs, to craft your tools around your workflow instead of the other way around. So most of this talk is actually just going to be a bunch of fun demos. I'm going to show you very concretely what this actually looks like in practice, what it feels like to live in a malleable software environment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why this problem matters so much. So maybe let's start with a little poll here. I'm going to do a show of hands. Please raise your hand if you feel that all the software you use every day is perfect. It solves every problem perfectly for you. No one? Oh, John? No? Really? OK, huh. So you have complaints about your software. Interesting. Now, let me ask you, why haven't you fixed your software? Yeah, OK. Microsoft's not listening to you, really. OK, so it's interesting, right? Why haven't you fixed your software? That very question just seems kind of silly, right? We're used to this world where we don't really control our software. What we do is we lob feedback at companies and hope that they listen. And we all know you're sending feedback into a void, right? It's ending up in some backlog.
I think we adapt to the software instead of the other way around.
Exactly. We kind of contort ourselves, I think, often to fit the software rather than the software being, software could be like a leather shoe that fits to you. I think that's the vision, right? Now, the interesting thing is, it's not like the software developers are off on the beach ignoring you either. They're also trying really hard, right? So, if you've done any product development, this is not easy. I learned this firsthand at the beginning of my career. I worked at an education technology startup doing software development. And when we had like 2 customers, it was really nice because we could basically build everything they asked us to, and it was great, right? And then we started scaling and growing, and the more customers we had, the harder it was to actually listen to them. And we got into this very familiar position where you have this mountain of feedback, and basically a lot of being good at product development is saying no to everybody all the time, right? That's what you learn. That's like the common wisdom of how you be good at product is you have to learn to say no. And sometimes I think this makes sense. People ask for things that aren't the right thing. But often I feel that it's sort of disappointing because what they're asking for is actually a really good idea, but it's only a good idea for them. So we would have sometimes, a school would say to us, hey, can you change this one word in your product just for us? And my answer would be, if you were our only customer, it would take like 5 seconds. But we're building for thousands of schools, so that's not something we're going to do, I'm sorry. And this was just kind of, it felt disappointing to me to realize this was the reality of how software works, right? We've all been on, some of you have probably been on both sides of this equation. Now, from time to time, though, there'd be this very interesting little glimmer of hope that would happen, which is that some principal or someone would come to us and say, hey, I fixed your product. I exported the data into Microsoft Excel, and I made my own thing. Look, isn't it beautiful? And these spreadsheets, often they were really ugly. They weren't like polished like our product, and they had bugs. But they did exactly the thing that person wanted them to do, right? They would change the formulas to compute the scores differently, or they would group things differently, or they would just change that one word they really wanted to change, right? This is a different way of thinking about the creation of software. I'm guessing that many of you might not consider yourself professional developers, but you do work with spreadsheets a lot. There are these 2 kind of philosophies of software we can think about. There's the idea of apps, which is the dominant philosophy where some professionals make software for a bunch of people and ship it to them. You could even say impose it on them. And then there's the spreadsheet, which is a different approach. You're creating tools just for yourself. And when you want to change something, you just change it, right? And the more I started thinking about what's going on here, I started realizing we've gotten used to apps being the way things work. But if you think about that, it's a little bit strange when you compare it to how the rest of our lives work in some ways. So one analogy I like to think about is the world of software. It feels sort of like a food court. So you go to the App Store, right? And there's so many apps. There's like thousands of apps, and you can try to find the app that's good for what you want to do. And maybe you find the one. Maybe Panda Express is what you feel like today. But what if none of the apps actually does exactly what you need? You don't actually have that much fine control over your meal in a food court. You're just picking from a menu. Now contrast that with a kitchen. A kitchen is more work. So you do have to have a little bit of skill, put a little more effort in. And in exchange, you get way more control. Whatever specific goals you have about your food, you can do that in the kitchen, right? It's more open-ended. So it would be cool if software felt more like this, I think. And for many decades, actually, people have been trying to build systems that let everybody build their own software. But it turned out to be a really hard problem. And one of the reasons is that most people don't know how to program computers, or haven't invested the thousands of hours that professionals have, right? This is a huge challenge. And until recently, I think that sort of held back the progress that was possible to make here. But recently, with the advent of generative AI, I think the game is really changing. Because AI is capable, sometimes, for some problems, imperfectly, I'll caveat carefully, AI is capable of generating code. And what that means is you can tell it, I want code that does X, and it will give you code that does X. I'm not going to go into detail in this talk about how good that capability is right now. All I'll say is it's improving very rapidly. It's hard to predict how good it's going to get. But what I think about in my work is how can we take full advantage of that new AI capability in our software world? The analogy sort of to extend this is if we turn more of the world into a kitchen, if more of our software has this flexibility, then that AI coder can come in and be our sous chef. The AI can come help us craft the world of software around our needs. That's the goal. All right, so I'm going to show you some demos, as I said, but just quickly a little bit about the lab that I work at. We're called Ink and Switch. We're an independent lab exploring the future of tools for thought. Now, what that means is we're really inspired by the original vision for what interactive computing was supposed to be all about. There were these amazing pioneers, people like Ivan Sutherland, Doug Engelbart, Alan Kay. And they had this very lofty vision of software as a thing that would let us think better thoughts, bigger thoughts, solve more complex problems. Alan had this beautiful vision that software should be something you can change as you use it. This is the Smalltalk system that his research group invented in the 80s. He had this story of what if kids are playing a game and they can change the rules of the video game as they play it, right? And at Ink and Switch, we try to carry forward this vision and invent foundational technologies for computing that help realize this vision in modern computing. So that takes us, in terms of disciplines, it takes us all over the map of computer science. We work on all sorts of things. We work on low-level distributed systems algorithms for data sync and collaboration. We have a whole team working on programmable ink, we call it, using a tablet to think through problems and program on the fly. But I lead our work on, again, Malleable Software, designing these customizable software environments. So today I'm going to show you demos of 3 research prototypes. These aren't commercial products. These are prototypes that we've built to explore what this world would feel like, the future software that we want. What would it actually look like, really, to have malleable software? And we approach this by kind of finding real problems in our lives. We talk to partners like journalists and scientists who have these problems in their work, and we try to solve them in sort of small prototypes to explore this space. So that's what I'm going to show you today. All right, so let's start with this one called Potluck. I like to cook. I like recipes. And sometimes I use software for recipes. Now, when you use a computer to manage your recipes, it can do some kind of cool stuff. So it can multiply the ingredient quantities for you. That's nice. Computers can do math. It can set a timer for you to keep track of something. That's cool. But there's something annoying about recipe software, which is that it's kind of finicky. So for example, to get this ingredient thing to work, you got to put the ingredients in exactly in the right format into that ingredients list, right? And sometimes I just want to be a little looser. My mom tells me a recipe, and I just want to type it into my Apple Notes or something, right? There's this free-form feeling we get from just writing it on paper, right? You can scribble anywhere. You don't have to work in this fussy way that the computer understands. So with Potluck, we tried to figure out, could you have the best of both worlds? And we built this thing we call a dynamic document. So the starting point, this is basically a text note. Think of it like Apple Notes. You just type in whatever you want in whatever format. No form fields, no buttons. But then the neat thing is you can start enriching that textual note with little bits of computational behavior and tools. So for example, I can slide the slider here and scale up the ingredients for my coffee recipe, right? And this is still text, so I can still type. I can like change the original amount and it's still multiplying. Let's see, I want to change brew 2 minutes, let's say 3 minutes or something. And then I can set a timer right in line. So this is blurring kind of computational tools with a fully flexible text note, right? Now, the really interesting thing is these tools, the timer and the scaler, you might think these are part of Potluck. They're part of the tool that we built. But that's actually not how it works. This is more like a spreadsheet. So Microsoft ships you some basic building blocks in Excel, but then you're the one that assembles them into formulas that do what you want, right? That's how Potluck works. So I'm going to show you now how we can actually build a little version of this scaler from scratch ourselves. Now here we're going to call in our AI sous chef, and we're going to ask it to help us out. So let's say I want to just double my coffee. I'm making 2 cups instead of 1, right? All I do is I pull open this little menu here, and I ask, can you double the quantities? Now, the interesting thing is the AI isn't just going to, quote unquote, do it. It's not going to do the doubling. What it does is it's going to spit back at us a computational workflow that does the doubling, where we can see the steps that it's taking. And we see what it's doing here. It's kind of finding the quantities in the recipe that are measured in grams. It's doubling 11 to 22. And it's spitting those doubled quantities back into the document where we can read them. If I want, I can even ask the AI for help understanding what it did. So I can say, could you explain this thing to me? And it can walk me through step by step that exact explanation that I gave you. So the idea here is that we don't want the AI to be doing black box stuff. We want it to be sort of exposing all the logic to us so that we can understand what's going on, right? Now, another cool thing here is, what if I want to change the logic? So I can actually just make small tweaks myself. I don't need to go through the AI. So let's say, oh, another person came over. Now I need 3 cups. This time what I'm going to do is I'm just going to edit this little formula directly. So this is kind of like a spreadsheet. We find, oh, amount times 2. I can just change it to 3, 4, whatever. And you see that spreadsheet here, this formula drives what's going on in that text document. So it's live updating, right? So we have this principle here of we got a little AI help to get started, but then we have a lot of fine control and visibility into what's going on. That's the idea.
I'm curious, it's not doubling the brew time, which, of course, it shouldn't.
Yeah.
What's going on inside there that tells us not to change that?
Yeah, so part of the Potluck idea is that this thing needs to find the relevant information from the textual note to compute on. And so when I said double the quantities, it looked at this note and decided, it looks like the way you have written quantities, the way in your syntax, is that you did a number followed by grams. These are clearly amounts of stuff. And it's going to ignore minutes, right? So it wrote a pattern that only extracts numbers followed by the letter G for this particular document. Yep, question?
So I actually had a question like Tony's, but of course I was going to spin it to make it more harder. So, for example, if this was a recipe for microwaving, then in fact, the more things you're doing, the more time you do need in a not quite linear way, but let's pretend it's linear. So in other words, I would have to say, I would have to know that to say double the quantities, but figure out that time is, multiplied by whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a lot of nonlinear things like that in recipes where you change one quantity and something else needs to change. It's tricky. Sometimes I think those things can be captured to some extent by these simple numerical formulas which can be encoded in the spreadsheet. I think other times maybe you want to throw some of the computation back to an AI to do a little more fuzzy reasoning around that stuff. That's not something Potluck can do yet. Yeah. So the next thing I want to...
By the way, it's a cool idea. That wasn't meant to be critical.
Yeah, of course. And actually, I will say, so part of the challenge with environments like this actually is knowing where are the bounds of what I can do in it. So if I scale this thing, is it actually capable of changing other quantities and communicating that to people is a big part of the challenge. Okay, one last question then.
I'm just going to randomly point out to you that you can only make 1 cup of coffee in an AeroPress.
Oh man, you win the fact checker award. That is.
Well, you know, you're making assumptions, and the AI just doesn't know that they're counterfactual. So that's
Yeah, absolutely.
kind of an interesting point where they just crash into a wall.
Yep.
But it's telling you what it's doing.
You need to know that you can't pour 3 cups of coffee in this.
Yeah, it's like don't follow the GPS off the cliff sort of situation. Yeah. Yeah, you could do multiple AeroPress, yeah, or a huge one. So a cool thing about Potluck, though, is that I've introduced it to you as a recipe tool, right? But it's actually not just for that. These same primitives that I've shown you that work for this work for all sorts of other domains. So you can make a little utility to track when you need to water your plants, or you can track a meeting agenda, or you can do a little bake sale cash register. And these are all very, very simple tools that, there are probably apps on the App Store to do this stuff, but we found that you don't need those apps. You can get away with very simple custom functionality with a text note and some formulas.
Could you talk, so down front on your right, it's cool what you've done, but it raises the natural question of when you're in, quote, production in a company, you have to worry about configuration control. I mean, which version of the recipe am I using? Oh, yeah, I changed the numbers. Well, in production systems, one has to worry a lot about which versions of stuff they're using for that particular process. How does Malleable Software allow for configuration control in a real production environment? And I'll give you one real example. I mean, when someone asks a chief information officer, hey, how many databases do you guys manage? The number is so far off because of the Excel spreadsheets that are in someone's drawer. They don't know. And yet that stuff is actually in production.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's a great question. I think there is sort of a natural tension here between top-down, centralized control and standardization of process versus kind of bottom-up, decentralized tool building. I mean, I think the thing I will say is, the spreadsheets may be a nightmare for some angle on the business, like knowing what's going on from the middle, but they are the lifesaver for a lot of other parts of the business, right? Like, we've all seen the spreadsheet that holds everything together, and think about if that spreadsheet hadn't existed, like, what would you have done, right? And so I think those are challenges, but the way I see Malleable Software is actually seeing spreadsheets as a good thing more than a bad thing, and bringing that kind of scrappy, do-it-yourself ethos to more of our software, not less.
Are you guys going to launch any of these?
People always ask us that. This is online. You can actually use it and try it. We don't launch them as products, though, because our goal, which I'll talk about in a bit, is the point actually isn't Potluck. This is just one prototype, one glimpse into the future of software we're trying to build. And we actually take a bigger view where we're trying to build an entire platform where this is just one part of it. So let me keep showing some demos, and you'll see more angles on this. OK, so we found Potluck pretty useful, and we thought, how can we push this dynamic document idea even further with more powerful tools, right? So we did this exploration called Embark. And for Embark, we decided to focus on another task that software is sometimes frustrating for, which is travel planning. So you all had to make a plan to come here. You may have booked a flight or coordinated with Nancy around hotel stuff, right? And there's all these apps you can use that are pretty nice, actually. You can use Google Maps to find the route to the airport. You can check the weather. You have your calendar. All these apps, on their own, actually work pretty well. The problem is they do not work together at all, even in basic ways. So I always find myself digging around in my email, finding the address of the place and copy-pasting into Google Maps, right? And then, oh no, 3 days later, I forgot how long it was going to take, so I have to do it again. Think about how your weather app doesn't know where you're going next week. So you have to manually type in, I'm going to this city next week, and look up the weather, even though your calendar app totally knows where you're going next week, right? There's a lot of context, to go back to the earlier talk, that is not shared among these various applications. And again, if we look at the analog world, it sometimes feels like software has taken a step backwards. Like if you just plan a trip with your calendar and all these brochures spread out, sure, there's a lot of ways that's worse than software, but it does kind of feel like it's all more part of a unified substrate in some way, right? So with Embark, we wondered, could we, again, kind of get the best of both worlds with a dynamic document? Okay, so this is a trip planning doc. It's a real one that I used to come here. So this was actually a pretty simple trip for me because I live in DC, so it was a short trip. But I still, nonetheless, had this document. And this is essentially just a text document to start where I can type whatever I want, right? So this is nice because I can just assemble all the stuff I need to know, like this is my hotel info or whatever, in one place. And it's very flexible, freeform again. Now, the neat thing, though, is I can start, again, bringing in computational tools to help me out. So check this out. How do I get from my house to here, this hotel? I don't need to go copy-paste these addresses into Google Maps. I can bring the routing into my document. So I'm just going to type, basically, drive from home to conference. And check it out. Boom, it's going to take an hour. And there's a map. Yeah, the time depends on time.
No, it's not pulling from Google Maps?
This is pulling from Google Maps, but we've brought the Google Maps tool into our document, not the other way around, right? Another cool thing is now that I've looked it up, it's there in my document. So when I come back to the document, I don't need to look it up again. I've saved the result of that lookup, right? Let's do the same thing for the weather forecast. So I'm just going to type weather. Boom. Weather at this hotel on Tuesday. Let's do the same thing. Weather at this hotel on Wednesday. And it's right there. And again, I didn't need to copy paste anything manually because the context for what it needed to look up was already in this document, right?
Quick
That's
question.
pretty neat.
Are you saving the result or saving the query? So for example, if you looked at the weather on...
Yeah.
Right?
So we save the query. That means when you come back, the forecast updates, right? That's something that a paper document or a screenshot can't do, but a dynamic document can. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's going to freak you out, like if the traffic, for example. Traffic changes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, really what it should do is it should actually save both the query and the result. It should save the history of, the forecast was this or whatever. So we don't do that yet, but we should. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, have you guys played around with other visuals based on like a network graph or hierarchy graph based on the information you have here?
Oh, good. Okay. Can you say a little more about what you're imagining there?
Because we use a lot of different software tools based on our data, right? And I could see this being used, the ability to save the query, right? And so what we do, because we work with a lot of data scientists and a lot of Intel analysts, and it kind of allows the Intel analysts to have a lot of power over how they're processing the data to get the end visual. So when I seen your map, and I heard that you said you saved the query, it's a good way of coming back to the same graph, but having that updated information in it.
Totally.
Have you guys played around with that idea?
Yeah, so the map is just an example of actually, we have many types of views in the system. Currently, they're specialized around travel. So there's maps and calendars. I think maybe there's a couple others. But if you think about this more generally, what this tool represents is you have data in the context of a document, and then you can have arbitrary views over that data. So you could totally imagine that kind of thing existing in a version of the system. Yeah.
I'm just going to request my fantasy ask, which is you use my email as the data source and just calendar out everything it tells me about what's happening in every deadline for submission, and then I could just edit from there, yes or no. You should be able to do that.
I love that idea. I will say,
dying for that.
So there were privacy questions earlier, right? And I think there's an interesting thing about Embark, which is that in this system, it doesn't actually automatically suck in anything. You manually construct the document. And so that's limiting in that you do have to do some work to get it in. The nice thing is that you control what the context is. And so it is kind of bounded in that way. But that is an interesting idea. One more question, and then we'll move on.
So first of all, I love this because I think we all need this just for living, right? It's one of those things where it's like, how did I live before? But as I look from a corporate hat, right, there's this concept of you're creating UDAs. It's still a glorified spreadsheet, right? Your shadow IT, blah, blah, blah. I'm in innovation, so I can add the blah, blah, blah. But I think what would make this, take this to the next level from a corporate perspective is how can you then take this thing that I have custom made and that I may continue to iterate on and then learn how to integrate that or automate the creation of that tool at an enterprise level in all, with all of the constructs and, limitations or, audit, blah, 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 right? That a corporation adds on.
Totally.
And so are you guys thinking about how do we take this and turn it into a more official tool but still maintain the flexibility to modify it?
That's a really good question. Frankly, we haven't thought much about it yet because we're a tiny lab and we build for ourselves mostly. But I'd love to talk to people here about the challenges involved in that. Yeah.
I'm going to go way out on a limb and say, hey, didn't we just see a talk about how to automate processes a second ago?
Yeah.
Like
That's true.
And actually that's not a bad process to automate, which is, productionizing software. So.
I think if you take this though and produce this as a framework, so any company can go build the things that are interesting to them as well, that then becomes really powerful. So documents is one thing. When I think about how our organization communicates or has done in the last 5 years, it's all through Slack, and very little email and not a lot of note taking. But again, embedding this kind of capability in tools like that would be very powerful.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just drop a Slack to Stuart about blah, 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 yeah.
I want to keep moving because there's one more demo I want to show you. But actually, first let me show you, there's a couple cool things we were able to, so Embark is interesting because travel planning, the reason we chose it as a domain, actually, is that every trip is really different, right? So no two trips are the same, and there's this huge long tail of weird kind of shapes of trips, and it's not possible, actually, for commercial developers to make apps that serve all of those niches. And that's where a flexible tool like this comes in. So one of my collaborators on the trip, he essentially lives in an RV and was doing these huge RV treks across the country, planning an Embark. Another one of my collaborators on this project did this adventure rally across Europe called Poles of Inconvenience, where you have to visit a number of very inconveniently located geolocations in Europe. There's no app for planning that, right? He was able to use Embark as this flexible substrate to decide where he was going to go and evaluate different options. And that sort of shows the power of this spreadsheet way of thinking, is that even when you have weird problems that no developer is thinking about, you can take matters into your own hands, right? All right. So those were kind of more personal use cases, I would say, recipes and travel. Now I want to turn to our last demo called Patchwork. And the origin of this was we're a research lab. We do a lot of thinking together using software, collaborative writing, whiteboarding, task management. And we thought, what would it look like to take this philosophy of malleable software into that kind of environment? And I hope this is interesting to you because probably, I'm guessing you do stuff like write with other people, do task management, right? So how does this malleable software idea feel in that context? Now, one of the important bits of context here is that creating with others is a really messy process. And part of our goal with Patchwork was to provide really nice tools for managing that collaboration and that mess. There's all these revisions of things. You're kind of going back and forth, suggesting things and reviewing things. How can we make that process easier, right? For example, this is just one instance of many. We brought in this concept that software developers are familiar with called branching. So we have this kind of web-based environment that's sort of like Google Docs, where default everything's live. But there's one simple change, which is that you can go make your own copy and work in it in a corner. And then when you're ready, you can come back to the group and say, hey, here are a bunch of changes, please review. And once you kind of sort that out with people, you can merge those changes back into the main copy, right? This is a very simple idea, but most collaboration tools don't have it. And in our experience, we found that it's absolutely critical for enabling people to actually calmly think about stuff without being constantly bombarded by the kind of live collaborative setup. Now, where things started to get interesting here was that we realized, hold on a second, these tools for collaborating with people also are useful for collaborating together with AI. So we've heard a little bit today about how AI can be unreliable. We realized part of that, just like you don't always agree with your human collaborator suggestions, you might not always agree with your AI suggestions, right? So it's really important to have tools for suggestion and review. Here's a little example. Let's say our paper got rejected, and we want to spice it up and get it past the review committee. So I asked the AI here, please add some jargon to the title. We've all been there. And so it's going to go off and think for a second. And once it comes back, it's not going to just do the edit. It's going to make a suggestion with a branch where I can clearly see what changed.
Yeah.
There we go. What do you think? Should we take the suggestion? Is this going to work? I think so. Let's try it. So I can accept or reject. And we'll accept it and merge it in. OK, great.
I've got a question. If you're doing this, do you lock it? If you take out a copy of the document, is it locked? Because you could have multiple people trying to, so how do you,
Great question. So
database issue.
we've actually worked on a ton of data infrastructure, so you don't need to lock. So you can always go off, and two people can work in parallel, and you can merge the results back together. And we have algorithms that try to do a best effort at merging that in a sensible way. Now, that's not to say that working in parallel is always a good idea. Sometimes you may choose to lock because you don't want to have two people editing the same section at the same time. However, we found that it is really important to have the ability to merge changes when sometimes it is nice to work in parallel.
The great difficulty in being able to merge is resolving merge conflicts. Is that something you are working on, or just taking kind of existing merge conflict rules and?
Yeah, so developers are familiar with the concept of merge conflicts, which is basically when two people work in parallel and the work that they did doesn't fit together. So it no longer works together. And we absolutely think all about that. Our goal is actually to minimize conflicts as much as possible, but they are inevitable. And our philosophy is kind of that you actually can't even automatically fix them most of the time. The goal is to provide tools that let humans know when a conflict has occurred and really ergonomically see what happened here and how do we fix it. Yeah.
So the term jargon is almost by definition context dependent. How did it know to look for jargon is it reading the article and then kind of feeding back, or how is it learning?
Yeah, so by default, this AI helper just has access to this document that we're looking at together right now. The metaphor is kind of like you and the AI are looking at the same artifact together. But you can also give it other context. One thing we found really nice is you can give it a style guide. So we gave it our organizational style guide for writing and had it edit our essays. And we found that to be very effective. So you can dump all sorts of context in there. Yeah. All right, I have one more demo I really want to get to, and then we'll do questions at the end. So this is where I wanted to get to with Patchwork, which is we just saw AI helping us edit a document. You may be wondering, wait a second, what does that have to do with this talk? And what it has to do with this talk is that actually that same process I just showed you for writing can actually work for editing the software itself, OK? So I'm going to show an example of that now. So here's another thing we do in Patchwork. It's managing to-dos. This is one of our views of my to-do list, and I can see how many cards we have in each column, in each status, right? And I had this feature idea, which is it'd be nice when we have 5 things going on for our team. That's too many. I want to say, we can only do 3 things at once. So let's be aware of that rule, right? Let's just add that as a feature to our software the moment I have that idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to hit this button that says Edit Tool. Now we're going to do a little inception here, where we're going to pop into a software editing mode, where now we're editing the software from within itself, OK? I can even open up the code. If I'm a programmer, I can literally edit the code live from within the system itself. I'm just going to give it a red background as an example. And now that's running live, not only for me, but actually for all of my collaborators as well. So just like we collaborate on documents together, we collaborate on our software, right? OK, so that's cool. This is sort of the software kitchen idea. But again, most of us, not everyone knows how to program. And even I, who do know how to program, I'm too lazy to be opening up source code while I'm in the middle of something, right? So what do? AI sous chef. We bring in that same AI from a moment ago, and we ask it for help. So what I'm going to do here is pop open that AI sidebar and just ask it to build the feature for me. This isn't the Anthropic Claude model. And I'm going to say, I want to set a work in progress limit, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry too much about the details, but I'm just describing the feature that I want, right? And the AI has access to the code of this app, and it has access to modify the code. So interestingly, the first thing it's going to come back with isn't a change. It's actually going to ask me a bunch of questions. Now, this is a very important step that we've programmed in. If you just jump from a one-sentence app idea to an app, it's not going to be what the person had in mind. There's actually a lot of critical questions to figure out. So this has to be an iterative loop where the goal of the AI isn't to take some preconceived notion from the person's mind and spit it out as code. The goal is actually to help the person realize what they even wanted in the first place, right? And if you have any background in design or you've done any product development, you know when a client comes to you and says, make me an app that blah, blah, you don't just say, great, OK, we'll see you in a week. We're going to build it, right? It's a conversation. And that has to be the way it works with AI as well. OK, so it's thinking now. And in a few seconds, it's going to come back with a suggested code change. And again, we're going to be able to live preview it. OK, so look at this. It added a column to this app where I can set a limit on the status. Let's try setting it down to like limit of 2. OK, look at that. It turned red as a warning. When I raise the limit, it's OK. So this is saying you have 3 cards, but a limit of 2, that's red. OK, that's enough QA for me right now. I'm not going to go into more depth. The QA is a whole topic. But for now, I'm just going to say that looks good, accept it. And now, again, this feature is running live, not just for me, but for all of my collaborators, right? That's what it looks like to author software in the moment as you use it. And the neat thing is, this is now a tool in my arsenal. So if I'm managing to-dos, I can see, oh, I'm red. I got to drag something out of in progress. I see the warning, right? And this is sort of, it's an interesting feeling when you're using software to be able to edit it on the fly. It goes back to something that Alan Kay said 40 years ago. When he was thinking about what computers were for, he said, we now want to edit our tools as we have previously edited our documents. That's the promise of computers, that because it's all software, we should be able to do that. And what I just showed you in Patchwork is we went from editing documents to editing software with kind of the same rough affordances, right? That's the idea of malleable software.
I have a question.
Yeah.
To your left. Yeah. So when you create this malleable software, would you then, in the real world, share your source code with your users so they can go and edit this? Like, how does it actually work?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? I didn't hear.
How would you actually change software without sharing the source code to your users?
Yeah, good question. How do you change software without releasing the source code? So we actually, fundamentally, all this stuff is open source. It's all based on the idea that the code is shipping to the user. And obviously, open source has existed for a while. In my opinion, most open source hasn't truly been open in the sense that even if I have the source code for like Linux or Chrome, what am I going to do with that? Like getting set up to the point where I could edit it is like days of work as a professional, right? This is showing a world where it's more truly open source. But you're right that actually having code access does seem like a prerequisite. I don't know if it's possible to do in a closed source way, frankly. And I think an interesting possible thing that might happen here is that there might be incentives towards open source, because if everyone's capable of editing code, there's actually more value to them having the code, right? Let me just conclude with a few points, and then maybe I have time for one more question. So what have we learned from these prototypes? What are the takeaways? What are the lessons we can take from these prototypes together? There's a big difference between a medium and an app. So an app has a particular goal in mind. Think about a piece of paper. A piece of paper, you can do a lot of stuff with it, right? All these demos I showed you, they're closer to a medium than an app. There's another idea that I find kind of beautiful, which is when you're in a wood shop, you can take the same piece of wood between a hammer and a saw and a chisel. Your data is decoupled from the tools you use it with. Whereas in apps, what we do is we often couple the data to only be editable by one tool, right? And so can we make your data more flexibly something you can carry between tools? And finally, again, this key point is that if the world of software is more like a kitchen, then the AI sous chef can help us. If it's a food court, you can bring a chef to a food court with you, and what are they going to do? They're ordering from the menu just like you are, right? And so the idea here is to prepare for the ability of AI to code. We need to get the world more ready in terms of providing more hooks for you to code to craft software around you. All right, that's basically all I had. I'll just close by saying we have a bunch of cool stuff in the works. We're working on applying these ideas to authoring scientific papers. If that's something you do, I'd love to talk to you. We're exploring Patchwork for collaborative game development. And again, a lot of our work actually comes from partnering with others. So we love working with outside parties, whether it's companies or research groups. And we love testing these ideas out in the real world. So if any of this feels compelling to you or might feel relevant to you, I'd love to chat. And that's all I got. Thanks so much.
So Tony, do we have time for one question? So the one question I have is, first of all, love the idea. But when you get down to deeper level coding, things get way more complicated. So for example, most people don't realize when I send you an SMS message and you reply about 1 million or more machine operations have been programmed into that whole thing, often through stacks and stacks and things. So it's really sort of, it's great at the moment you showed us all user-facing stuff. And have you thought about getting into that deeper code development where it's kind of the middleware and infrastructure code rather than the user-facing code?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll say a couple things. I think there's this neat idea of pace layers that Stuart Brand popularized, where you have like slow-changing infrastructure and fast-changing skins. And I think, pace layers. And I think that we can think about that here in the sense that I think often many of the things people want to tweak are actually pretty shallow and don't require infrastructure changes. Like moving one button doesn't actually require going down the stack. Now, it is true though that sometimes, I guess the analogy would be like you ask your renovation architect, can I like just move that wall? And they're like, oh no, that's structural. And then you're like, can I move that wall? And they're like, oh yeah, totally fine. And so it's hard to tell. And sometimes making a small change to the user requires a big infrastructural change. And I think that is definitely a big open challenge and stuff, especially because one of the challenges is the AI models, their coding capability. It's really hard to describe the ceiling, but I would say serious systems programmers don't get much value from them right now. Whereas as a UI prototyper, I get tremendous value from them. And so there's kind of a going to where their strengths are today. As that changes, I don't know how that will evolve, but that's where the state of play is right now.
All right. I would just speculate based on a conversation I had with Alan Kay, because what we're talking about here is introspection. And the amount of the intellectual quantity to add introspection is probably on the order of 10%. It's not huge. Just FYI.
I was going to call on you before we wrapped up because Alan was always one of the most difficult people in the room in terms of hammering the speakers. Do you think he'd be pretty happy with, pardon? Great, great. Okay, so
thanks,
we think you would get Alan's seal of approval.
So I will share on the platform as soon as I can find the link. On Wednesday of last week, Alan gave a talk to the UN Science Summit, and there were then respondents and things like that. I was lucky enough to be one of them. But given Alan's health, it may be the last big talk he gives, and it was phenomenal. It was sort of his summary of sort of everything he said all these years. So I'm going to try to find the link to that and post it to Nemerdes. So keep an eye out for that.
Really. Phenomenal. Geoffrey, thank you so much. This was really a wonderful presentation.